And I was asking the students on the last day before I left, what is a film for? Basic question. And the answers were like, well, it's to entertain, or it's to instruct, or to send a message, or to stimulate us. And these are all, perfectly respectable things to say, and, sort of obvious things to say, and no doubt true. But what I should have said and didn't was, why is it so important that you be entertained, stimulated, instructed, sent a message, or me? What is so important about you that the film should do this for you? And I would like to reverse this, implicit hierarchy and say we have to go to the film and do what the film wants us to do. And this, in part, I don't want to get too broad, but I think, the way audiences think about it does have something to do with two things that have been happening in the last 30 years, let's say, happening with regard to the role of the audience and the position of the audience. And one thing, of course, is the rise of technologies that permit the viewer to take a so-called more active role and even become a so-called co-creator of the film, first with video and now, of course, DVD and whatever. And fine. And then the other thing, which I think is related, although they're not often maybe discussed in the same breath, the other thing is the rise of the cultural studies view of the world as sort of revolving around the spectator, and that the spectator is the hero or heroine of cinema. The active spectator, the agent, somebody who has agency and is exercising this agency through some kind of engagement with the film, and so on and so on. And in a way, I'm opposed to both of these things. I want the viewer to have less agency and less control and just sit and watch the fucking film in the dark, in a theater, and not fuck around. And so if this could happen, then I think then we could start to talk about cinema in a way that critics should do. I know that, I'm partly kidding because I think this is an unrealistic and even very bad position to take, and I'm wrong to take that position. So I'm even contrarian to myself. But I felt like saying it because I do sort of believe in this old school model of the passive spectator, the somebody who has to sit through the film as an ordeal, even as a torture. Jacques Rivette said that the role of film is to take people out of their cocoons and plunge them into horror. And I believe that, there's a lot of, I would support this statement, Maybe not every film can be described as doing that, every film that we like, but this is something that a film should aspire to. And a critic, well, what would be the critic's role then? To, of course, to champion those films, the films that plunge us into horror, that sort of impose themselves on the viewer in a very imperious way, that demand that the viewer change herself. So those are my thoughts to start.
I'd love to discuss strategies with you later on. How do we get the audience to sit in the dark and sit still? But first I'm going to give the mic to Neil, who's sitting next to you, because I think Neil already sort of discovered that this whole idea of rejecting the audience is in fact in practice in criticism on certain recent films, amongst them Black Swan and The King's Speech, where the critics and the audience are rejecting each other. So please.
Thanks. It's interesting that Chris used the phrase plunged into horror, which makes me think of plunged into a horror film. I'd like the audience to watch more horror films because I think it's a underrated and marginalized genre even now. And when directors make horror films, there's still a kind of idea that they're somehow lowering themselves. And to me, they're aiming very high. And I think Darren Aronofsky, when he made Black Swan, my view is he tried to make a horror film. I don't think it worked out for him. I don't think it suited his aesthetic, his approach, but I thought it was a brave try. Interestingly, Black Swan is number 2 in the audience voting here in Rotterdam. And the number 1 film is Beautiful by Iñárritu. which is neither beautiful nor Black Swan, well, certainly beautiful, has been largely pulled apart by critics. I haven't seen the film myself, but I was at a London screening with a group of critics, and they walked past the poster for Beautiful, and they'd all seen it, and they pulled faces and made vomiting motions as if they wanted to wipe the film from the face of the earth. So I think there's clearly the audience likes to be plunged into horror, because Beautiful, which I haven't seen the film, but I know it's an unremitting catalogue of misery and despair, and Black Swan isn't exactly a laugh either in terms of its psychological journey into darkness, although I think personally it goes to such ludicrous extremes that you do end up laughing at it. But I think the audience is harrowed by these films, and these films do have an effect on the audience, and I think it's fascinating in a film like Rotterdam, where you have exposure to such a wide range of films, that those are the ones that people are interested in seeing, and you could argue that it's saying something about the dark financial times that we're living in, and people want to see people. There's a thing in Britain, we say there's always somebody worse off than yourself, and I think in cinema quite often if you spend 3 or 4 hours watching starving peasants or people in terrible dire straits, you leave the cinema, you think, well, maybe things aren't so bad, and in a way that's confirming you in your comfort zone. But yeah, The King's Speech is another interesting example. The film which was supposed to be the closing film here in Rotterdam, and which was pulled at the last minute. And this film's been a huge box office success in Britain, outstripping all expectations. But I don't really know very many critics in Britain that I know who even think the film is much above average. I mean, to me it was the sort of thing you get on BBC on a Sunday afternoon and eat a packet of biscuits and drink a cup of tea while you're watching it. So why it's suddenly become this Oscar juggernaut which is going to propel Colin Firth to the podium, it's slightly baffling. So I think maybe critics these days have become estranged from the audience, and maybe this is because critics do tend to see films either at film festivals, and when they go to film festivals, often at press shows, or they go to press screenings in big cities. And so in London, which I don't live in London, but I very occasionally go to a press screening, and you are aware of a kind of pack mentality, and people do come out of the cinema and stand in small groups, and you can sort of observe that a consensus is being formed there, which to me is it's an interesting sort of anthropological, psychological process. Whether it makes for good criticism or not, I would rather suspect it doesn't. And I don't think it's a coincidence that any horror film or teen comedy will routinely be trashed and pulled apart by British critics, regardless of its merit. And for some years, I was known around town as the bloke who liked Dude, Where's My Car? Which was taken as a sign of shame. So when I went to the film festival circuit and found international critics who regard the work of Danny Liner as worthy of praise and serious attention, I felt like I was coming home. So so as I say, for me, when Adrian talked earlier also about moral responsibility, I think it's the old thing, you've got to be true to your own views. But one thing that was very interesting in our discussion in Ljubljana, Eugenio Renzi was telling me about Cahiers du Cinema, where they adopted a more of a committee approach, and they would sit around the table and come up with a committee view. Do we like this film? Do we like this filmmaker? Do we support Apichatpong? Do we support John Frankenheimer, whoever it is? And coming from a sort of individualistic British tradition, where, personally I think it's best if each person makes their own mind up and says so in print, it was kind of fascinating to learn that there's this, whole other school of film criticism, which then I think leads to the canons that we've talked about, and we do get institutionalized positions where certain film directors are elevated to a high peak. And whether we follow them to that peak or we look down on them or try to demolish that mountain is maybe one thing that can lead us out of our comfort zone and be contrary to the grain.
Well, Neil, I actually have a trivia question for you. Well, first of all, I should say I'm so horrified by this discussion that I've spilled my coffee all over the floor. I apologize to people here in the front row. A question about Dude, Where's My Car, actually. What object functions as a continuum transfunctioner in Dude, Where's My Car? Is it A, a Rubik's Cube, B, an Atari 2600 video game system, a flashlight, C, or D, an AM/FM radio?
Can I phone a friend or do or 50-50? I'll ring Yuri Meden in Slovenia. He'll tell me exactly what it is. I've got a feeling it's a flashlight, but I could be wrong about that.
Does anybody else know? Oh, Okay.
This is the critic asked the question.
We'll have to phone Yuri on that one. But okay, back to the trivia questions later. We have some prizes for the audience. I wanted to talk a little bit about this concept of let's say the practical implications of taking oneself out of the comfort zone. And the first one for me was it was very organic. I was dissatisfied by what was at the multiplex, the films that you could see in the neighborhood, and I wanted to reach out first to go to maybe independent video stores and things like that, and start trading with people on the internet, and then eventually to go to film festivals. So coming to Rotterdam was a part of that experience, and meeting people like Donna and Adrian, who were here on my first visit. And then you go back home after you've seen all this wonderful cinema, and then you're not satisfied with what you're seeing at home again. And then so you want to create a sort of space, which is what Christina was talking about, not only in your film criticism, but maybe you want to create that space with screenings, with film, creating your own film festival or film series, so that you're able to even write about it, because, an editor won't accept a proposition about some obscure Filipino film that you've seen in Rotterdam unless maybe it's showing in your hometown in Chicago. So as critics, we're really, almost by necessity, we have to take ourselves out of that comfort zone of just sitting down at our desk and writing. And it's really disturbing just to see that kind of critic who just, sits in one screening room in one city and watches just the films that the studios decide to send his or her way. And so part of our responsibility, I guess, to go out of the comfort zone, I mean, it has to do with personal taste, of course, but, programming these films, eventually teaching these films, so that people get a better orientation of them, a better context for viewing them. And it's not an easy thing at all. In fact, it involves things like fundraising, which who wants to do that? To be able to show films and fly in Filipino filmmakers to talk to students. So in practical terms, I'm interested in that. I'm interested in why my just dissatisfaction with commercial cinema has flung me into a different arena for discussion. And of course, I'm very intrigued by Chris's proposition that we should conform to the film, that the film should not conform to us. Of course, that's true. Of course, that should be true of any work of art, I think. And in fact, in other disciplines, I don't think that's such a radical idea. Just to put that into a larger context. And yes, Christina, go ahead.
I think you need tools to be able to. I think when you're, let's say, 18 years old and you have not such a lot of training in film history, and you're living like in a middle town which does not have a great offer in cinephile terms, then you need somebody who gives you tools. And maybe that's what you mean with opposing your audience, but I'd like to put it in another way, to give them tools.
Yeah, but you're too nice, you see. I mean, that would be the nice way to put it, yes. Give them tools. Yes, of course, a critic can do this. Speaking of audience, you know who was a good audience? There was a Pedro Costa retrospective at the Jeonju Film Festival 2 years ago. And at the master class that Pedro did, during the questions, a young woman, maybe in her 25 or so,